Welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be uncovering the manufacturing security risks in today's hybrid working and Industry 4.0. My name is Brett Ayres, Services Director at Teneo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm very fortunate to be joined by two experts on the subject of security. First, Andy de Clerck, who is Teneo's CTO. Teneo has been with the organisation since the acquisition of Geode Networks. Andy's got some 20 plus years experience in security, covering a wide range of subjects. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Mark Sangster, who is the VP of Industry, eSentire's VP of Industry Security Strategies, and also author of No Safe Harbor, The Inside Truth About Cybercrime and How to Protect Your Business. Mark is an award-winning speaker and often asked to comment on these subjects. So very fortunate to have him today. So today, as I've mentioned, we're going to be having a little talk around the issues around managing cyber risk and how it's imperative for manufacturing organizations to make sure they're protected if they're looking to enjoy the benefits of Industry 4.0 and take advantage of things like IoT and hybrid working and a range of other technologies to help their businesses. So Mark, if I can come to you first, why are manufacturers becoming a prime target for cyber criminals?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen an industrialization of cybercrime, ransomware as a service, and they're literally buying the tools and techniques and expertise just the same we would with, say, cloud-based services, right? Like whether it's a manufacturing production or it's customer management and those sorts of things. And frankly, manufacturing makes for a very good target because any company that's either susceptible to reputational damage or operational disruption is the kind of market that these criminals want to go after, because they know if they shut you down with ransomware, as an example, they understand the impact to your business, the costs, and potentially how that affects the supply chain in which you operate and you contribute. And that kind of pressure leads to people making payments. So, unfortunately, manufacturers, healthcare, and those sorts of industries are the places where these criminals are going to profit.
So Andy, so why are we seeing such a rise recently? And obviously, Mark talked on sort of industrialization of it and sort of cloud and subscription type services for this. But why the increase?
So what's happening is that there's a desire to move the process into the cloud for agility, for performance. They classify it as a function as a service. And as they do that, they open themselves up because they're untiering a lot of connectivity where things can actually resonate and impact the recipes, the controls of systems, controls of machines, disrupt that supply chain. In industry, they're used to understanding a production monitoring system of the physical elements of what they're producing. The reality is, if you take the digital supply chain, which every business has, that's the same thing now, and it's more embedded into everything that everybody does. And any element of that that gets disrupted will actually impact their overall business efficiency and their stature in their industry. And it also extends out to their third-party suppliers and their compliance models that that they potentially have to adopt those levels of compliance and make sure that their suppliers are embedded into their process as well, to make sure that they have a safety net, because they have a lot of old technology in there. They have a lot of old PLCs, they have a lot of technologies that run on very old code that's untested, untrusted in the modern world that often doesn't get updated. And that's where a lot of these things they harbor, and they're ready to basically, they're keeping an eye out and watching and waiting when to trigger. And it's very easy to do it on the low-hanging fruit that interrupts a bigger picture that we've seen, as has happened with ransomware across supply chains as it is today.
So are you saying that manufacturing is an easy target for ransomware?
Potentially, it's the third biggest target for ransomware in the world, which I think some people will be quite surprised, and that's the latest statistics on that. And it makes up probably more than 46% of the overall problems that they have generally.
Okay, so Mark, if I come to you, so where are the vulnerabilities within these manufacturing organizations that are being attacked?
So I'm going to start with some of the non-technical ones, and then we can move downstream. So that information technology side of the house, right? So the front office, that's accounting, ERP, email, file transfer, all that kind of stuff. to some degree understands what cybersecurity risk looks like and what the threats are like. And of course, they take those, those reactive measures, things like firewalls and antivirus and endpoint protection and, the whole alphabet soup of all the cybersecurity acronyms to protect the business. On the operational side, as we move to more of an interconnected industrial IoT kind of world, and not just the connection of those devices, but what Andy's talking about. So the cloud-based management systems, right? Like marketing execution systems, SCADA controllers, all those various, servers, all those various pieces. The OT side of the world doesn't necessarily understand what these threats look like. And often the IT side of the house does not talk to the OT side of the house. And they're motivated by different things, right? So the engineers on the factory floor, they're about production and optimization, and that's what gets their bonuses. And on the IT side, they're motivated by other things. So there's a bit of a lack of collaboration there. And often at the executive side, or the executive level too, they frankly don't understand the threats. Like, think about what Andy just said. Nearly half of all the ransomware attacks we see target manufacturers. Yet when you read the headlines, yes, there's a few, but the majority of them talk about these sort of Fortune 500 big brands, government attacks, pipelines, retailers, hotel chains, and those sorts of things. And because of that, that creates this false sense of security in the manufacturing world, particularly at the small and the mid-size, that say, look, we have nothing we're stealing. We're not a target. How would somebody in Russia know we even exist? And so on. And that's absolutely dead wrong, right? They don't care what your postal code or your zip code is. They don't care how big you are. They know they can still get money out of you. And in fact, the small to medium-sized ones, frankly, are a heck of a lot easier to go after than the big top tiers. And that's why they attack supply chain elements. But then down in that system, when we start to talk about that, as you've connected all those devices on the factory floor, the assembly line, the pipeline, whatever it might be, you've got multiple layers of systems that can be affected. And there's lots of opportunities, which I know we're going to talk about a little later, to infiltrate those, right? It's a more complex ecosystem that you use. And unfortunately, what we see is a lot of the security emphasis and protection only looks at part of it. So they haven't opened the aperture far enough, right? So they're not really defending the IoT level or systems on the same level that they would the traditional systems like email servers, domain controllers, firewalls, et cetera, that we're all kind of used to doing. But criminals know how to circumvent those systems. And then from there, they can migrate into the factory floor. And then that's where they're doing, that's where the real damage occurs.
So Mark, on that note, because absolutely, that increases the attack level, the attack threat surface, the IoT devices specifically, because they're really embedded now into the industrial process, and many of them are actually calling home into the cloud. But the other piece in there that I think that needs to be considered as well when you look at that risk of cyber attack is you've got the intellectual property as well that's going with that. Because obviously if they're involved with and they can attack the instruction set down to the machine floor, then they're going to obviously be able to start to accumulate the data around whatever the recipes are, whatever the components are. They're going to have eyes on all of that as well, which then means you've got the other risks that move you into the third parties or around circulating and collecting and storing that data, the bits that you just touched on. Those are some of the other areas that I think need to really be embedded. And you talk about understanding the prominence of those components, but they're used to monitoring. Right? Monitoring is telling you what just happened. It's got to move to observability, right, which will tell you what's happening right now and to be able to understand the sandbox and react to something.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? When you talk about observability, there's the old Air Force term, what's it? Let's see, observe, orient, decide, and act, OODA, right?
Yeah.
And it's exactly it, right? I have to understand what's happened. I need to make sense of it. Based on that, I need to decide what actions to take and then act. And I see this all the time in security is, people are like, well, we bought this ML engine, or we're doing this over here, or we've bought threat intelligence feeds. I'm like, and what do you do with them? Right. And they're like, well, nothing, because I don't have the staff to be able to manage that stuff. And it's like, then what's the point? It's a fundamental waste of money. And worse than a waste of money, it's actually opening you up to legal vulnerability because you've identified a threat. You took some half action to protect yourself or mitigate yourself from that risk, but you haven't really. right? So it's almost worse, because if you don't know about a problem, well, there's a bit, there's almost a bit of ignorance there, right? You can sort of say, look, I didn't understand. When you've identified a problem, you willingly know about it. And if you haven't taken action to actually protect it, you are in trouble. And you're right, Andy, there's other information in this, like the recipes that could be in the Jason Bourne kind of world, used to manipulate and damage that system, or disrupt productivity or ruin productivity. But on the flip side, that's all sellable. If I know what to do with that as a criminal, or I know who to sell it to, well, now somebody can make the knockoff version of your product. And we see this all the time. We saw this with pharmaceuticals as an example, and you lose 20% of the value of that product when that happens. And I imagine for investors, it wouldn't be thrilled. And in a supply chain, we're seeing that too as well, where the big dogs in the supply chain understand, they're handing over that confidential information to you as a subcomponent manufacturer. And someone can use that to go back up the system, right? To reverse engineer it. And so you might think, oh, we only make the tires for the tank, as an example, or the vehicle, but they're entering through the tires because they know you don't see yourself as a potential target. But now they're going back up to get to something that is more critical, like the navigation systems in that or the fire systems, or whatever it might be, that has, not just military, but economic value.
So, Mark, you mentioned that potentially, ignorance, or maybe not even thinking that you're a target, is a reason firms are not investing more in kind of security measures to defend themselves. Are there any other reasons why manufacturing, especially, is not, making these necessary investments to protect themselves?
Yeah, I'll put it in, there's a few misconceptions. The one is that we're not a target, right? And the second big one is that a lot of times they think that they would be able to identify these problems if they occurred, right? Well, we've invested in security. We have a firewall, we have antivirus, like I said, right? We're Noah's Ark, we have 2 of everything, so we're safe. And they don't understand that the threat landscape constantly changes, and what comes in is not obviously fake. So they think about things like streaming services, right? Is, BBC iPlayer or Netflix or something. You get the message that says that your credit card's been rejected, and click on this convenient link to update your payment methodology. And, they all kind of smirk and snicker at it. And the reality is that's not what's happening. It's things like fake lawsuits that were publicly available court documents that have been stolen, tweaked to reflect the target organization, and then sent as if litigation is starting. And of course, what happens, the CEO or the CFO receives it, says, what is this? They flip that to their legal counsel. Their legal counsel takes a look at it. And by then it's over, right? They're already in, and they've moved on. And I think the third piece of this, and this is actually the one I find the most frustrating, which is what I know we're going to talk about today, is this notion of fate, this sort of fatalistic approach, which is, well, if, a nation state, if China or Russia or North Korea or some massive ransomware gang like DarkSide or whoever it is comes a calling, there's nothing we can do about that, right? We're never going to be able to stop that. And there was no signs before, we went from like a good day to a bad day where everything shut down. That's simply not true. There is a trail of forensics that has occurred before these criminals act. And I think it's breaking those misconceptions and helping organizations understand that. But at the heart of it, there's the economic value. Andy's talked about this, right? There's lots worth stealing. There's lots worth disrupting, because they can turn that into money. And then there's a complexity of a system, and a system that is adapting, right? So that move to cloud, as an example, creates unknown. And this is a good point too, particularly for the senior management to understand. Not all risk comes from bad guys, right? When we think about cyber risk, like, oh, that's those nation states and those nasty people. But no, it's the emerging technology. It's a technology you choose to adapt because it has business value to you. So you look at the benefit and you don't necessarily look at the cost. And that's unfortunate. Or the cost turns to be the, what's the actual dollar or pound value this is going to be to me, not what some of the other knock-on costs look like. And all too often we see that. So the contract gets signed with the vendor, and the ink is drying on the contract, and it's thrown over to the IT security team, who then has to make it safe. But you put 0 provisions into that contract. You didn't look at the obligations. What were their minimum security standards? What information passes back and forth through those boundaries or that connection and relationship? What are our obligations? And if something were to occur, how quickly would you be notified? And what are they going to do about it, right? Who's on the hook for what?
I think you're right with that, Mark. I mean, people think about that and they forget about the supply of the technology that they're using as well. You know, that those are some of the third parties that are really important to understand, you know, how they employ, you know, things like blockchain in the future to try and, you know, overcome some of these challenges that you have when you onboard a new technology. And the other side is, you started to touch on it there, two things. One is, when those things get to that board level, especially on the smaller scale with smaller operations that are key to a lot of business today and business process, the threat to them personally is very easy to exploit, with threats and everything else, which become very, very fast, personal to react to, which also changes behavior at executive level in business when they need to sort something out when they're under that ransomware threat. And the other part is that in industry, and this is generally across the board, there needs to be this change towards, and I hope this drives you into the next topic a little bit, Mark and Brett, because it's about security surrounding everything. Yeah, that observability needs to be there in front of the application, in front of the process, and in between them. So it's constantly being observed, constantly, and it's designed as a key process, not an afterthought, not a middle thought, not an end thought. Right? It needs to be there all the way through. And, you know, business needs to start to adopt that and understand. So it's security is built in. You manage your own risk. You give less away to your competitors. You give less away to the threat impactors that are trying to, you know, interrupt your business. Basically, you control it more.
And do you think that's sort of ignorance on the part of the organisation, or lack of understanding, or simply a case of, well, if it happens, it happens? And
I think it's more lack of understanding, lack of information, right, of where when things are fragmented, and let's face it, as you move to the cloud, there are even more fragmented tiers as you connect into it. And it's understanding where those fragments are and how you fill those gaps between them and turn that dimmer switch up so you understand what's happening and where the threats are. And the other side around that is, through that understanding, is people accept we have this business technology, this business application that's going to help us achieve what we want to achieve. Security is not built into those things today. They come afterwards. You know, the concept needs to be security and add those to the security tunnel, compliance, process, so that you're surrounding it and you're aware of it before. You're reducing your risk all the time, and it's all about risk.
So I mean, listening to both of you, it sounds like there's an awful lot of things to consider out there. So if I'm an owner of one of these organizations, how can I go about identifying where my weak points are? And Mark, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, that's where Andy's got it right. It's you conduct what we call a risk assessment, and you look at all of those things. So you look at the assets, the information that you have, and what they're connected to, and who it's shared with, and what they do with it, and so on, and what all those systems are, and that kind of creates a bit of that profile. And there's some technical testing, of course, that can go along with that, right? Like actually trying to penetrate those systems and determine what sort of access we can get. But it's also not just the sort of the technical elements; it's also the people, right? So who has access to that information? What credentials do they have? What privileges do they have? And all the time, particularly in manufacturing, I see this as well, is that the most vulnerable people, so the more senior people, are the ones that have the most privilege and frankly don't need it, right? If you're an executive or a senior engineer, do you need access to that SCADA server, as an example? Because are you actually doing any work on it? Or do you need access to those engineering workstations, as an example? Maybe you don't, but because you do and you have that privilege, that can be used. And that's why criminals go after credentials. So understanding what all of those risks look like, and then creating a risk profile and a prioritization. But again, it's back to the business side, which is, what are the most critical things? What do you have to protect if you only have limited resources? Because of course you do. You know, it's like you can't guard the entire castle, but you can protect the keep. So work out, what it is that you need to defend the most, and then you build your security and you align that program around it. And a lot of times, as I said, it's not just doing the assessment of the organization, but it's also helping those executives understand, what does insider threat look like? And that doesn't mean they're malicious. It might be that they've been duped and tricked into doing something that the criminals want. The vendor threats that come in, even maintenance, right? well, I wouldn't even say the bad old days. You still see this, right? The laptop that walks into the environment is connected through a serial port, and off they go to do some kind of maintenance. And today, most of that it can be more virtual. And you don't know what they're carrying or infected devices. And the migration from the front office, criminals know exactly how to go after you. They know how to target specific functions within that business, and then when they get in there, they know how to migrate. Like, they're pretty smart about this stuff. And that's a good point too from the risk perspective. Is it's not a kid in a basement, mom's basement. These are professionals. There's an ecosystem that surrounds them, just like yours, of people that, maybe they don't know how to do one part of the attack chain, but they know another. So they're really good at crafting phishing emails that manufacturing execs click on, right? There's somebody else who's really good at taking those stolen credentials and getting into the environment, creating that initial intrusion, and someone else who's great at persistence, who knows how to move within your environment at that point, to create new users, to deploy scripts or beacons or bad guy technology throughout, so that someone else can come back. So it's literally like they've left that back door unlocked, and then the criminals can come in later. Understanding that's what you face. And frankly, Andy kind of hit on something too when he talked about what it's like at the executive level. Everyone forgets the emotional human elements of this. So you might look at this and go, we have cyber insurance, and we have, we've got these protections, and, we'll just call law enforcement, and we're a big manufacturer and the government's going to have to step in. No one wants to be in that position, man. It is stressful. It is terrifying. When you've got your board starting to question you, when you have insurers questioning you about whether or not you met your own security standards, it's not a fun time. It's a bit like auto insurance is the analogy I use. No one would be, in the cyber world, we're cavalier. In the auto world, we're not. Just because you have automotive insurance that will protect the value of your vehicle and replace it and deal with any resulting healthcare costs as injuries in an accident, do we drive like, maniacs because, so what if I break my back? Because, I got health coverage, that'll cover me. And, I'll go through that. Well, remember the pain and the rehabilitation suffering. It's the same thing. And people just don't think about that in a kind of virtualized world, but you are going to go through it. It's not fun, and it's not a pleasant time.
I think that's a really, really good point, Mark, because I'll use the motoring analogy a little bit more because people resonate with it. The other side of that as well is, and this is about managing your own risk, which is no different, is when people get into a motor vehicle and they drive, often they'll have an incident because it wasn't their fault. It might be a more minor one or whatever, but they'll say, but it wasn't my fault. Well, actually, right. You can affect the outcome, right? Because you may be doing 5 miles an hour over the speed limit or whatever, and someone pulls out in front of you. Well, it wasn't my fault because they pulled out in front of me. But actually, if you were doing 5 miles an hour less, you probably would have stopped in time and you wouldn't have come together. And right. It's no different in security, right? So that, when you look at that risk, who owns the risk? And the more complex and event-driven an environment is, I think it's more likely there's value to be derived from providing that consistent, continuous observability, right? So that you can do and apply that same methodology in our own, from a personal perspective, of what we do as we operate with our business and in our domestic life as well, because it applies the same, taking that care and being aware of what's going on all the time. And then that can help you make decisions. A few extra seconds, I would say a few extra seconds, you'll make a slightly different decision and avoid something. We're in a rush. People are generally in a rush. Like you say, they get the email, they get some phishing data that looks really, really, because it's been intercepted and crafted specifically to you. So it looks absolutely insane to you. It's from a trusted source. And actually, if you used to just go and click, I'll do that because I'm in a rush, boom, gone. And it's just those few seconds extra yourself needs to be built into people.
So Andy, as a small manufacturer, perhaps with maybe a very small security team, maybe one person in some cases, I don't know what I don't know. Where can I go to get help with getting this risk assessment so I can understand better the situation I'm in?
So that's the area that we're trying to address with our customers today. Is coming to organisations like Teneo, whereby we work with our partners at eSentire and offer these services, because it's important to understand where they are, and as Mark said earlier, understand where you want to invest to secure the best way of making sure that you're not at risk and your assets aren't at risk, and you're not going to be threatened unnecessarily with undue pressure that you can't control, that you're going to surrender something. I always say the assets are your digital currency today. It's really important to understand that, and we can help with that. We can also help with trying to alleviate how those assets are protected, with using things like zero trust policies, identity awareness policies, building those into the ecosystem to help make sure that the observability, the monitoring, the awareness, and then if something does kick off, right, and it will do, you've got an assessment very quickly through the tools that we use with our partners, like eSentire, etc., whereby you can analyze that in near real time very quickly and make an assessment. Is this normal? Is this abnormal? Can we go for it? Should we isolate it? I don't care whether they're the CEO or an exec. Is there a risk? We need to do something and inform. And we can help with that. And the other thing you said about, and Mark touched on this as well, that's really important. The threats from within, doing penetration from outside is really easy. Doing penetration from outside usually uses things like TCP port threats, things like that.
Yeah.
That's different. The behavior inside is the flow of that data, how the applications are used to working, because when ransomware triggers, it infects another file. From that moment, it bloats that file, even by 1 byte, but it bloats that file, the executable, and then it runs. So you have a date change, you have a change in file structure. Those are things that can be picked up. And then once it runs, it's running on a trusted known port in a trusted known way that suddenly ramps up and it's too late. And those are some of the things that we can help to identify, doing tests and audits and things that Mark touched on internally as well. Because if you look at the supply chain threats that have and ransomware that have succeeded, it's through VPNs, it's through some of the trusted things that are left. Those kinds of things that we can help with.
Okay, so good. And so it sounds like a really good sort of starting place to build from. So Mark, if once I kind of know what I'm exposed to and I've identified where the risks are and what I'm trying to protect, what's the next steps? What should I be looking at in terms of building a defense posture?
Yeah, so with things like managed detection and response, as an example, I think this is kind of where we're trying to go, is understanding what those risks look like, but creating the observability, right? And really managed detection and response is about that. The notion here is that on a 24/7 basis, you have security experts who are monitoring that environment, right? Looking for signs of something that's suspicious or potentially malicious. And when they find it, being able to investigate. So it does start with that. And really the critical element in this is understanding how to, collect signals, collect information from all of those systems. And what we often see is, what I keep, I've mentioned them before. You talk about the sort of the security bread and butter, like firewalls and antivirus and all this kind of stuff. It's all there, but it tends to be focused in one direction in the IT environment and not the OT. And we kind of forget about that piece. So being able to open the aperture and see all of it and then deal with that information, correlate it, figure out what it means. So do that investigation. And then here's the big part, right, is act. So contain it, disrupt it. And the way I talk about this is, when people say, well, have your customers ever been breached? And we can argue what breach means. Do you mean, have they been attacked and has somebody infiltrated them? Yeah, all the time. That's not the point, because you're not keeping them out all the time. But if I catch them quickly, if I see them use that compromised credential and I then investigate and I stop them, or I catch them deploying a script and I'm destroying that script and I'm blocking that connection, it's kind of cleaning up spilled milk. Right? It's a minor little nuisance event. Maybe I'm resetting some creds, somebody gets some remedial awareness training, and we review policies and say, hey, you're not using multi-factor authentication. None of this would happen if you did, right? And we can fix that, and we can fix it quickly. If you don't do that, if you didn't observe it coming into the environment and you didn't observe it moving around laterally and spreading, it metastasizes. And that's when it has a very negative outcome. And that is when that misconception about we didn't know anything until it detonated occurs. But they've been in your environment for a long period of time. In some cases, it's months long. It doesn't always take that long. Sometimes it takes hours, right? But they are going to move around. And if you can't spot these things and you don't know what they mean, I just worked with another institution who we were literally, I was doing some risk work, and they were hit by ransomware a week later, and a story I'd given them came back to haunt them, which was, as I said, you'll see concurrent logins, you'll see failed logins from the wrong geos, a lot of stuff that you can block easily, new users being created through remote administrative tools. And those are all the kind of things that we observe and look for. And of course, that's what happened. And this poor fellow came back to me afterwards. And he said, yeah, one of my IT people called me over the weekend and said they found some users, they couldn't really account for them. They tried HR. It's the weekend, nobody responded. And, and they kind of went, yeah, I'll deal with this on Monday. And of course, Sunday it detonated, and it was a hospital, and it shut them down. It was 4 hospitals actually, and it shut them down, and they ended up paying $500,000 in ransom. And so it's that ability to see what's happening, to understand what it means in context and react. And where in manufacturing this becomes far more critical is a lot of sort of security technology, and the philosophy behind it is I either know what it is and I block it, right? I just stop it because I realize it's got a criminal record per se, or that I've got some magical big red button that I just, press, and, and that system is quarantined. And that's very good in the IT world in some cases. If someone's laptop gets infected, I can press the button and my endpoint quarantines it. It can't talk to any other device on the network anymore. Whatever it is can't spread. That's great. But I can't do that in a manufacturing environment without understanding what I'm big red buttoning, right? It's like that old kids cartoon where there was the 2 big red buttons and one made a cappuccino and one launched the nuclear weapons, right? And it's kind of the same thing, because, well, what happens when I shut down a SCADA server or I knock a workstation off, right? And that has a domino effect that trips the assembly line and causes whatever damage, lost productivity, or worse, some kind of mechanical damage because something overheated or whatever occurred. So it's a lot more the devil's in the details, and you really have to understand what you're doing and be able to cooperate and work in tandem with the client to be able to say, okay, this has occurred with this system. Now you have to make that decision. And that's, again, where it plays back up to risk at the exec level, which is, okay, we found this SCADA server is infected. Do we shut down the system to clean it, or do we wait for a maintenance window? And there's never a good answer here. It really is, it's the lesser of 2 evils, and that's what you have to be able to deal with.
So it sounds like sorry, Andy. I say it sounds a bit like to me though that we should almost be architecting for the reality that we're going to be breached at some point, rather than trying to stop every threat. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. You should. You are bang on, right? And this is about this understanding. Part of that risk assessment is understanding what would the likely attack scenarios look like, and then having those sort of, to some degree, on the shelf canned responses that you can say, okay, given the circumstances, here's what the trigger actions look like. Because if you're running around trying to figure out where the fire exits are, while the ship's on fire, it's kind of too late, right? That is something you have to prep. That will also open up and expose a bunch of communications issues and decision challenges that will occur between the technical team and the non-technical executives that might have to make that call. And that's, I've talked about assembly lines, right? And you see this all the time where you decide to shut off remote access, and now it becomes public event because your clients can't get to you and they know something's wrong.
Do you want to add anything to that, Andy? Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, with technology today, event-driven architectures are really important. Industrial workplace has been used to that because they health and safety, all the things that go with that, the events that drive the production line, the build of components, the logistics, from raw product in to product out, etc., and into the supply chain to be sold on. They're all critical events, upstream, downstream. That's true throughout everything that we're doing now at every level. And the more things move to the cloud, we talked about blockchain earlier. Mark talked about some of those areas on certain servers being attacked. You've also got to be able to take into account today the serverless architectures, where these things are going to spin up, spin down, and they're gone. And some of those are going to be gone, up and down in 20 seconds to do a certain task. So by getting this methodology embedded into your process today, you're going to start to make yourself more risk aware, control of your risk as well, and also protect your business continuity and everything around your business that you need to do moving forward.
I also read as well that DevOps is a real kind of area of concern for some organizations in terms of how that's secured. What are you seeing in that space, Andy?
So when we look at DevOps, the problem that I've always had is the biggest attack out there today that you see day in, day out, by the trillions is the old SQL injection attack, which is where most of them actually start. And it's one of the oldest attacks, in the world, in the modern world. And it's there because applications, when people develop and learn how to develop applications, they develop the application for the outcome that brings to the business or the problem it solves. And security is not even considered. So this is where the flaw is. That's always been an overlay, which is why there are, as Mark mentioned earlier, there are so many of these threats already existing in infrastructures not to scare anybody, but they're there today waiting, right? And they will be triggered in some, and they might not be in others, but they're already, sort of infested out there in their little nurseries, waiting to grow up and go and wreak their havoc as a teenager. But the other side of that is today, we need to move towards that secure mode first into every process. That's not just when applications are developed, it's when they're deployed. It's how you integrate different parties of applications from different tiers of your operation. Security needs to be embedded. So people talk about, and often in the industry world, they talk about DevSecOps, which means you develop, you secure, you operate. That's still wrong to me. You should be secure, develop, secure, operate. So you're continually recycling and relearning and syncing up that security feedback process all the way through, which means that then when you come to deploy, the event-driven architecture that you've created, which is also driven into the cloud, you can optimize then for the experience of the user, the business, and the application, and understand, because you've got that inbuilt observability, so you know what's happening. And as Mark says, you can make those decisions, and a lot of them still are human to a degree, but there are things that you can start to pick those patterns out very quickly.
And what are you seeing in that space, Mark, the DevOps space?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is somebody has a better mousetrap, or they're an expert in a particular technical field or application, and that's what they develop, and they don't necessarily think about the security. And frankly, being a practitioner brings that myopic view, because they don't think about the sort of the wider world out there that's got all this sort of scary in it. So they're honed on optimizing whatever the outcome is of that tool or application. They're not really thinking about how it could be misused or abused, right? And so Andy's bang on. Like, I love that SecDevOps approach. And it's the same thing we saw with privacy legislation for the public, right? With GDPR. Privacy by design, security by design being baked into it. Start with that premise first. What are my obligations and what do I have to secure? And then move into, okay, now that I know that, now I'm going to build out this application. Because you're right, if you don't do that first, often it's a heck of a lot harder to kind of undo what you've built to then have to go in and retrofit in the security versus understanding what it should have been in the first place. So just like every other requirement you'd put into your product requirement document that says, it has to do all these great things and this is how it's supposed to work, you also have to have the security ones in there first, because otherwise, developers kind of run amok, right? They'll do what they need to do because, again, they're being paid to deliver an application that does something, and they're not necessarily at this point being motivated to secure it. And if they don't understand why they need to or why it's important, and again, it's not just in manufacturing, we see this in other places. Finance is a little different because, robbing banks has just been the thing for, millennia. But in healthcare or transportation or other places where they don't understand how that system could be abused or somehow manipulated, they don't tend to focus on it. And we do need to take a security first view. Think about your car. You lock your car every night. You wouldn't buy a car that didn't come with locks or an alarm system. So why do you allow that in your critical billion-dollar manufacturing environment?
And you
just
both
wrap your keys in tinfoil.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you both touched on earlier about, obviously, with the supply chain and the fact that as a manufacturer I might be reliant on multiple third parties, both upstream and downstream.
Mm-hmm.
What steps can I do to protect myself with those connections that I might have, whether they be VPN links to suppliers or to my customers or whatever it might be?
I can start with the three. Sorry, Andy, do you want to
go? No, you go first. Right.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that sort of for me, third party is 3 Ps, which is policies, prevention, and promises, right? So you need to have policies in place as an organization first. So how do we work with vendors? What does that look like? How have we measured our risk? How do we augment our risk profile based on their contribution to our ecosystem and so on? Prevention's about things like understanding how that vendor, what risks they bring, and then putting whatever minimum security requirements in place, and doing that due diligence, right? So understanding what we look like as a collective, not as individuals. And then the promises is, of course, your contracts, right? So not just defining what the service looks like, but division of duty, who does what. You installed and configured it, but am I on the hook to update and maintain it? We need to know, so that, on the back line, as an example, one defender thinks that the player's been picked up and they haven't, and they score because they were unimpeded, right? That's the kind of thing that you want to avoid. And then, of course, notifications and indemnifications and all that stuff.
For me, that's good. The policy and process is the ultimate part. And because when you peer effectively, when you peer with another third party as part of your business supply chain, they're peering with other people as well. So you've got to make sure that their policies are right, because they're being extended further on to other companies. So we're all slowly coming together with the same challenge, and we need to make sure that things are equally matched. And like you say, the demarcation of who was responsible for what, it actually is really important to address out. But this is where that zero trust, not zero trust network access, but zero trust to those assets that people are using, that identity awareness from those corporations that you're dealing with, and mapped into that observability you were talking about before, Mark. Those are the things that really become important. And more as organizations work with service providers, like we're both service providers to our customers, we're being challenged with those same questions day in, day out. And we have to, with the partners that we deliver services with, like eSentire, like some of the other ones, we have to understand those compliance models and the security certifications and the way things work and the people that are involved, who has access to things ourselves, because we're taking part of that responsibility, but we're also handing some of it off to our customers as well. So that integration, in an industry to any business is really important to understand. And organizations that don't take that responsible approach to look at how their business partners operate from a secure perspective, to make sure they have the right compliance levels to upgrade components, even down to Windows security updates. Let's be frank about it. Simple things, and the behavior within the business of how, and this is down to people. Do they regularly do security updates for risk, and how they work with phishing things? All of that ongoing training education is really important to bring to the table when you discuss any contract with any third party, supply, service, or other, moving forwards, in my view.
So there seems to be an awful lot to think about there. And as a small manufacturer, a medium-sized one, obviously I've only got so much time and so much money to spend on security, even if I do truly understand the potential risks out there. So from your perspective, Mark, where should I spend first? What's going to give me the most return for my investment?
Yeah, the first thing is determine what your risk looks like, right? Spend that time understanding what it means in your business and what the outcomes would look like. Because I hear this all the time, right? Well, I don't have time to do this. We don't have enough resources. I don't have the money for that. And it's like, yeah, but you just coughed up 500,000 to pay ransom. So you do have money, right? You did. So understanding what that looks like, and again, finding that balance. Because there are a lot of tools out there, and yes, you need to have the fundamentals of cybersecurity in place, right? So things like proper password hygiene and multi-factor authentication, and using some kind of secure connections like VPN or SD-WAN or whatever it happens to be, moving up the stack, right? There's all those pieces that I think we need to have, and the NCSC, for example, the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK, CISA, which is the public arm of DHS in the US, and in Canada, the Cybersecurity Center as well, have put out some pretty good standards around this stuff to kind of say, this is what brushing and flossing looks like in the cybersecurity world, and particularly for some industries, manufacturing being one of them. So those are helpful places to look for those basics. But those are just basic guidelines, right? You become a lawyer in all these talks, and people ask you a straight question, and your answer is always, it depends, because it does depend on your business. It does depend on what industry you participate in, how critical your product is, what's the supply chain looks like, right? Somebody making beverages is going to have, health and safety issues around, making sure it's not contaminated. Someone who builds auto components has to make sure that the car doesn't fail and there's an accident or aviation or something, right? So the ante is always different depending on what you do and what your supply chain looks like. And frankly, not even if you've been breached, but if someone like you has been breached. Because once bad guys they take that, lather, rinse, repeat kind of approach. Once they've worked out how to manipulate someone in this area, this sector, then they know how to do it again and again and again. And it's a proven model, right? So they'll keep doing that. And then they'll figure out how to move out tangentially. Okay, who is like beverage manufacturers? Oh, probably, meat production or something. And so, they can shift to that. It's the same idea. And that's why you really do have to understand what you're doing, and look at those resources, talk to, both our companies. That's where we help, right? Is try to demystify some of this stuff and give you the, what's the first out of the gate thing you need to do, or flipping that around. If a regulator came calling, if law enforcement showed up, or you were making an insurance claim, what are the first questions they're going to ask you so that you're prepared?
Yeah, and it's being prepared is really important. As you mentioned, that risk audit, that risk analysis, understanding where your risks are, because if you do it intelligently, ideally you want to do everything. The real world is it's almost impossible. But if you do it intelligently, you can take control of it, and you know the areas you need to be more aware of, but they're not going to impact you should somebody breach it, compared to the assets that are really important to you. That's your business currency at the end of the day. And you said before, it's down to the people, because you also need to understand, and it's down to human resource in organizations as well. You need to understand sometimes, depending on your industry, the background of some people that may be working or have access to the services that you're delivering. So it doesn't mean to say you have to tell them who they are necessarily, but some do insist on that. We've got customers that do insist on that. But it does mean to say that you're doing the right background checks if they are working in a certain environment or with a certain customer.
Yeah.
And they're all questions that have to be asked. You're absolutely right. The policy is critical.
So, and if you had the opportunity to be in front of the executive board, and you had 60 seconds to put the message across, what would you say?
So I would say it's about observability and de-risking your assets, so that you can protect it, you can stay agile, you can stay dynamic, but you're aware of what's going on. Because if you shut down too much, you can't operate. There's always that fine balance, but you can be in control and you can be aware of your risk and you can enable it. And it's about making sure that every tier of the operation, that's right from the ground up, through the shop floor to operations at an IT level, to the service delivery, through sales, right to executive management, everybody is aware. And everybody knows, should something happen, what's going to be the procedure you're going to follow in that incident situation. And there can be run books. There's the integration, as we talked about, with the MDR side of it, where you get the additional value that we bring to help the organizations do that, because it's really important. It's expensive to do it if you want to build a team to do it yourself. And that's where we can help you.
Okay. And then we're nearly at the top of the hour. So Mark, is there anything that you'd like to add before we close out?
Yeah, if I give the 60 seconds here, I would say that, speaking to executives, cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve. It's a business risk to manage. And one of the best ways, I think, to sort of bring that to light is to engage us and do a workshop, right? I'll walk you through simulations and show you this and throw some technical terms at you to create a deliberate obfuscation to then say, well, okay, a domain controller has beacons on it. Well, so what? Well, they actually own your network and they can do whatever they want now. And that changes the tone to show them that a lot of things that occur are business decisions that will have business impacts. They're not technical decisions. They're not tools to be turned on or switched off. There's no light switch that fixes this, but we can give them a starting point. And to echo Andy's point, yeah, it is hard to do. And a lot of companies start out with we're going to build a security operations center until they realize how complex and expensive and hard to staff it is. The problem's been solved, right? We've invented the wheel here, and we can help.
It's important on that note, Mark, those workshops, they help translate the bits and bytes, the digital unknown, to the context of business. So that they understand what those beacons really mean and what the impact's going to be, because otherwise it just goes whoosh.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Speak the right language. That's that. And then we see that, right? Technology talks ones and zeros, and executives talk in currency, and that's the problem. Is I think that disconnect probably goes right to back to the beginning of this, which is that's why these events occur, because the two sides, don't have a common vocabulary through which they can communicate.
That's great. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Some really interesting conversation there. Lots to consider for the manufacturers out there. But please. any manufacturers out there or any other organizations that are interested in today's topics, please do feel to reach out to Teneo, either through the website, www.teneo.net, or to your account manager, and we'll be happy to speak to you further about that and put you in touch with eSentire if required. Gentlemen, thank you.